My name is Alana, and I'm 33 years old. I live alone in a small bungalow just outside Raleigh, North Carolina. It's not much, modest, quiet, and still smells faintly of fresh paint in the back room. But it's mine. I bought it after 10 years of working 2 jobs, skipping vacations, and saying no to almost every pleasure in life so I could say yes to one thing: freedom. For once, I wanted to have something that wasn't shared, borrowed, or tied to guilt. I wanted to wake up in a space where every decision was mine. I wanted stillness, safety, ownership. I never expected that owning my home would make me the villain in my own family. The day everything changed, I was folding laundry, barefoot and still in my robe. It was a Wednesday. I remember because I had finally taken the day off. I was thinking about repainting the bathroom, maybe going out for coffee. Something simple. That's when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw my mother first. Then my brother. Then his wife, holding their toddler, with 2 other kids standing just behind them. Their car was in my driveway. The trunk was wide open, packed to the brim with bags and boxes. One of the kids was holding a toy giraffe, the kind that squeaks when squeezed. I opened the door, stunned, expecting maybe a visit. Certainly not this. My mother stepped forward before I could say anything. Her voice was sharp, like she'd rehearsed it. "You'll all live together now." That was it. A statement, not a question, a decision already made. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even flinch. I just said the word I had never said to her before. Not like this. Number. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your peace, I hope you'll like this video, subscribe, and stay with me. You're not alone. That moment changed the entire structure of my life. Not just what happened outside of me, but what shifted inside. I stood there, frozen, as if I'd left my body. The porch beneath my feet felt foreign. The house behind me, suddenly fragile. My mother's face twisted not in sadness, but disbelief, as if she couldn't compute that I, of all people, had denied her something. And my brother, who had once used my car for months without ever refilling the tank, looked at me like I had betrayed him. But I hadn't betrayed anyone. I had chosen myself. For the first time. It wasn't just about space. It was about the pattern. I'd spent my whole life being the backup plan, the one who never asked for anything. The safe one. The one you call when you need help, but never invite to celebrate. I grew up in a family where love looked like sacrifice, where being a good daughter meant making yourself small so others could stretch out, and I had played that role perfectly until I got this house, until the keys touched my palm and something inside me whispered that maybe, just maybe, I was allowed to exist for myself. But when my brother lost his apartment and my mom heard the news, I became Plan B again. Only this time I had walls, a door, a threshold she couldn't cross without permission. She didn't care. To her, family meant access, no boundaries, no limits, just expectation. And to say no wasn't an act of defiance, it was an act of betrayal. But to me, it was the most honest thing I had ever done. After I shut the door, I slid down to the floor and sat there for almost an hour. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just listened to the hum of my refrigerator and tried to remember who I was before I became everyone's lifeline. That silence was louder than any fight we could have had. Later that night, the messages started coming in. But I'll get to that. For now, all you need to know is this. That moment on the porch wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of me unlearning the version of love I was raised on. The beginning of me realizing that boundaries are not punishments. They are protection. The beginning of me becoming someone who didn't need permission to choose peace. And it all started with one word. I learned early that being dependable wasn't a virtue. It was a trap. In my family, reliability wasn't celebrated. It was expected. And once you earned that label, it stuck to you like glue, while the ones who broke promises and failed upward got all the grace in the world. I was the firstborn, not just in age, but in responsibility. By the time I was 10, I could predict my parents' moods before they spoke. I knew how to calm my mother when she was overwhelmed and how to distract my brother when he threw tantrums that turned into hours-long meltdowns. He was the loud one, the storm. I was the umbrella. No one ever told me I had to be. But when you're the only thing standing between chaos and collapse, you learn to become the bridge no one thanks. My brother Dylan was 2 years younger. He had this wildness in him, some combination of charm and recklessness that made people excuse things they wouldn't tolerate from anyone else. He could forget chores, yell at teachers, ruin birthday parties, and still get hugged at the end of the night. My mother called it sensitivity. My father called it just being a boy. I learned to just clean up behind him. By middle school, I was helping him with homework while managing my own. In high school, I held a part-time job while he dropped out of 2 clubs and quit the soccer team after 3 practices. He didn't like structure. He needed space. He needed understanding. I needed to be quiet about it. When he got into trouble, and he always did, it was my voice that calmed our parents down. When he wrecked my dad's old truck, I was the one who rode with him to the insurance office. When he couldn't pass a math class, I tutored him for 3 hours every night until he barely scraped by. And still, somehow, he remained the baby of the family, the one they prayed for, defended, protected. I was the backbone, and he was the heart. But being the backbone means you're not allowed to break, not even once. When I got into college, on a scholarship I nearly bled for, no one came to move me in. My parents were busy that weekend, and Dylan had a thing he couldn't miss. I carried every box up 3 flights of stairs by myself. I told myself it didn't matter, that independence was a gift. But part of me, even then, was already used to swallowing the ache of being overlooked. As the years went on, the pattern only deepened. I graduated early, found a job before walking the stage, and started sending money home within the year. Dylan, meanwhile, was still trying to figure things out. Community college for a while, then a sales job, then unemployment, then a girlfriend, then a baby, then 2 more. I watched it all unfold from the sidelines, always expected to cheer him on while quietly catching the pieces he dropped. And I did, because that's what I was taught love looked like: sacrifice in silence. I helped with rent once, then groceries, then watched the kids for a few weekends so he and his wife could reconnect. Each time I said yes, it was less out of generosity and more out of reflex. Helping had become my identity. Saying no felt like betrayal, not just of them, but of the image I had created for myself. Alana, the stable one. Alana, the one who always says yes. But stability isn't the same as peace. And over time, I began to feel the cracks. They showed up in the small things: how I hesitated before answering calls from my mother, how I braced myself before family gatherings, how the sound of my brother's name started to trigger an invisible weight on my chest. I didn't know it at the time, but resentment had been growing inside me for years, quiet, deep, like roots in the foundation of a house. When I finally bought my home, it was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter, a reward for the years I had held everything together. I imagined quiet mornings, the smell of fresh coffee, a garden I could call mine. I imagined hosting family only when I wanted to, not when it was expected. I imagined freedom. What I never imagined was that all the years I had said yes would come back to haunt me when I finally said no. Because in their eyes, my house wasn't mine. It was ours. Mine only in title, not in truth. And when Dylan lost his apartment, they didn't see it as his crisis. They saw it as my obligation. Looking back, I can't even say I'm surprised. I spent my whole life training them to believe I would always show up, always bend, always absorb whatever they couldn't carry. Of course, they thought I'd open my door, but that was the old version of me. The woman who opened the door and said no wasn't new. She was just finally awake. The morning after I turned them away, my house felt colder. Not physically, the weather was mild, but something in the air had changed. A draft of guilt crept in through the windows. I moved through the rooms I had once filled with pride, but now I noticed how hollow they sounded under my footsteps, as if the house was holding its breath alongside me. I thought saying no would bring me peace, and in a way, it did. But it also brought a silence that was heavy and sharp, the kind that fills your ears when you close a door that's always been left open. I kept replaying the moment in my head, the trunk full of bags, the look on my mother's face, the disappointment in my brother's eyes. Not sadness, not surprise, just that familiar, subtle kind of disapproval I had grown up knowing so well. The kind that didn't need to be spoken out loud to be understood. All day, I moved around in a haze. I scrubbed the kitchen counters even though they were already clean. I reorganized the pantry. I took the throw pillows off the couch, then placed them back in the exact same way. I couldn't sit still. My body was buzzing with something I didn't want to name, fear. Not fear of what they'd do, but fear of what I had done. Fear that by standing up for myself, I had shattered the fragile system we had all pretended was love. A system built on unspoken roles. Mine had always been the helper, the giver, the one who didn't cause trouble. But now that I had refused, I wasn't just the daughter or the sister anymore. I was the problem. By that evening, the silence was broken, not by a phone call or a visit, but by a notification, a single text message. I didn't open it right away. I stared at it like it was a bomb, wondering what kind of explosion it would trigger. I already knew the shape of it: guilt, disappointment, maybe even accusations. And I wasn't ready for any of it. I put my phone face down and turned on the TV. Some mindless reality show buzzed in the background while I sat on the floor, knees to my chest, unsure what came next. I had spent so many years anticipating everyone else's needs that I didn't know what to do when I finally made a decision for myself. There was no roadmap for this, no applause, no comfort, just space. Empty space that I had once craved and now struggled to sit in. The next day, my mother didn't call. Neither did my brother. But the message was still there, unopened. I finally tapped it open, expecting rage, but instead, it was worse. It was vague, cold, distant. A sentence designed to sound neutral but heavy with implication. I read it twice. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a real statement. It was something in between, a weight hung on my conscience, meant to make me question what I'd done. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked through my house again, room by room, the living room with the bookshelf I built by hand, the hallway with the crooked picture frame I never bothered to fix, the guest room I had painted a soft sage green, imagining it might one day host friends, or maybe just silence. But I realized that even though I had claimed this space with money and labor, it had never really felt like mine until now. Not until I had defended it. Still, the guilt clung to me like humidity. Every time I made a cup of coffee or folded a blanket, I imagined their voices. My mother's subtle sighs, my brother's quiet disappointment, the phantom sounds of children who weren't mine, echoing in rooms they never stepped into. It would have been so easy to cave, to text back, to open the door and say, just for a little while. But I knew how that story ended. I had lived it too many times. A little while always turned into just until things settle. And just until became there's nowhere else. And before I knew it, I'd be giving up my bedroom, then my peace, then myself. I wasn't ready to do that again. But that didn't mean I felt good. Setting boundaries doesn't come with immediate relief. It comes with withdrawal. The ache of detaching from a role you were praised for, even if that praise was manipulative. And the more I sat in that ache, the more I realized how deep the conditioning ran. It wasn't just about my house. It was about everything I'd been taught to be: generous to a fault, accommodating to the point of self-erasure. And now, when I finally said no, the silence that followed felt like punishment. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was space. Maybe it was room to hear myself think. Maybe for the first time, the silence didn't mean I was alone. It meant I was free. A few days passed before I convinced myself to reach out. Not because I regretted saying no, but because the silence had become unbearable. I wanted to believe there was still a way to fix things without undoing the boundary I had fought so hard to place. Somewhere in my heart, I still hoped that reason might soften the tension, that explanation might lead to understanding. I thought if I could just find the right words, they'd see I wasn't being selfish. I was simply protecting myself. So I sat down, wrote out what I wanted to say, erased it, wrote it again. I tried different tones: firm, gentle, apologetic, logical. Each time I reread my message, I felt less like a person and more like a defendant preparing for trial. I wasn't just sharing a feeling. I was building a case. Evidence of all the times I'd helped, of how hard I'd worked, of how much I'd given without ever asking for anything in return. I wanted them to remember those things. But deep down, I knew that people who respect your boundaries don't need evidence. And people who don't won't care how carefully you present it. Still, I sent the message. It wasn't long before the responses came in. Not direct, not personal, not even honest. Just vague disappointments masquerading as concern. Guilt dressed in politeness. My brother never responded at all. My mother sent back a string of sentences that made my skin crawl. Not because they were angry, but because they were so calm, so emotionally sterile, like I was being quietly disowned, not punished. I'd been removed, not confronted. And that's when I realized they weren't angry because I hurt them. They were angry because I had disrupted the system, the quiet agreement we'd all upheld for years. I was the one who handled things, the one who adjusted, made room, smoothed the wrinkles. My identity was so tied to being the good one that the moment I stepped out of that role, I became something else entirely: the enemy. In the days that followed, I tried again. I offered to help them search for a short-term rental. I found listings, called around, even offered to cover part of the first month's rent. It wasn't about guilt anymore. It was habit, muscle memory. This is what I had always done: try to fix, try to soften, try to keep everything from falling apart. But none of my offers were acknowledged. Not one reply. It became obvious they didn't want a solution. They wanted compliance, and I couldn't give them that anymore. I spent the next week walking around my house with the feeling that I was being watched. Not literally, but emotionally. Like my every decision was under quiet scrutiny from people who weren't even in the room. I started second-guessing small things: how loud my music was, whether I should park in the driveway or on the street, if it was okay to post photos of my house on social media without seeming like I was showing off. Their silence had become a haunting, not loud, just present, and I hated that I still cared. I hated that even after all this, some part of me was still waiting for a sign that they understood, that someone would say, "You're allowed to draw the line." But no one did. No one even asked how I was doing. The messages I sent became quieter, fewer, until they stopped altogether. I realized I wasn't having a conversation. I was throwing lifelines to people who had already decided I was no longer on the same ship. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth clearly. My place in the family had never been unconditional. It had always been transactional. As long as I played my role, I was loved, needed, praised. But the moment I stopped serving the system, I was recast. From reliable to cold, from selfless to selfish, from safe to dangerous. And yet, I didn't undo my decision. I didn't call them to apologize. I didn't open my doors. Instead, I sat with the discomfort. Let it simmer. I went for long walks without my phone. I read books I'd been meaning to finish. I cooked meals in silence, learning to enjoy the sound of oil sizzling in the pan without the need to distract myself from the ache. Each night, I stared at the ceiling and reminded myself, you're allowed to protect what you've built. You're allowed to want peace. You're allowed to choose yourself. The guilt didn't vanish, but it became manageable. And slowly, so did the silence. The first blow didn't come from my mother or my brother. It came from the family group chat. That chat had always been mostly quiet, an occasional birthday message, photos of my cousin's kids, reminders about holidays. But once word spread that I had refused to let Dylan's family stay with me, the tone shifted instantly. It was like a switch had been flipped, and suddenly the chat I had muted months ago was a swarm of opinions, judgment, and performative concern. I didn't even know how many people had been pulled into it. Aunts, uncles, second cousins. Some I hadn't spoken to in years. But now, my decision had been placed on trial, and everyone suddenly had something to say. They didn't mention me by name at first. The comments were vague, almost cowardly. Phrases like, "Some people forget where they come from," or "Family doesn't turn its back in hard times." But the timing and tone made the message clear. I was the target, the subject of a digital whisper campaign, thinly veiled in group morality. I didn't respond. At first, I told myself it was better to stay silent. I didn't owe them a defense, but each new message dug a little deeper. The passive-aggressive posts turned into pointed accusations. Screenshots were shared of my cold message to my mom, stripped of context, weaponized for sympathy. They twisted my boundary into a betrayal, a selfish act, an abandonment. It was surreal. These were people who had never offered to help me when I was working nights and saving for a down payment. People who had been absent through every sacrifice, every scraped-together budget, every lonely weekend spent grinding instead of resting. And now, suddenly, they had opinions about my character, about what I owed. I felt my stomach churn every time I saw that red notification bubble, but I couldn't look away. I read every message, every backhanded comment. Some were brutal. Others were worse because they were subtle, delivered with a smile, wrapped in concern. The kind of disapproval that comes not with anger, but with disappointment. And that stung the most. The silence from the people who knew better was deafening. The ones who had seen how much I'd carried, the ones I had helped, supported, listened to. None of them spoke up. No one said, "She's done enough." No one said, "Maybe she needed this boundary." Instead, they stayed quiet, neutral. And in doing so, they chose their side. But in the chaos, one unexpected message arrived. A cousin I barely knew, a quiet one, always in the background, sent me a private text. It was simple, a few sentences, but it acknowledged what no one else had, that I was being cornered for finally taking care of myself, that she had watched similar dynamics play out in her own household, that she saw me, even from afar. I didn't cry immediately. I just stared at the message. Not because it solved anything, but because it reminded me that I wasn't crazy. That what I had done was hard, yes, but it was also valid. It's strange how a single kind message can act like a splint, stabilizing something that felt fractured beyond repair. That text didn't stop the rest of the storm, but it gave me just enough strength to hold steady while it passed. The chat continued for days. My mom played the victim quietly, never explicitly attacking me but making sure her version of the story was known. That she'd been left out in the cold, that her hands were tied. that she had no idea why Alana was being so distant. It was performative grief, and it worked. People rallied around her. I watched it all unfold from my kitchen table, the same place I had once signed the mortgage papers and cried from pride. Now, I sat there feeling like a stranger in my own life. But I didn't leave the chat. I stayed. I watched. I let them say what they needed to say, because every word confirmed what I had begun to suspect all along, that their love had limits, and it was attached to my compliance. And now that I had stepped out of line, I was expendable. Oddly enough, that realization didn't break me. It freed me. The moment I stopped seeking validation from people who had only ever loved the version of me that served them, I began to feel something new, something close to peace. It wasn't loud, it wasn't joyful, but it was steady, and it grew a little stronger every time I didn't respond. Thanksgiving came faster than I expected. It always does when the air turns sharp and the daylight slips away too early. Most years, I welcomed the ritual, the food, the smells, the predictable cadence of the day. But that year, the thought of showing up felt like walking into a room with a knife still in my back. I considered skipping it. I told myself I had every right. No one had reached out to make peace. No one had invited me directly. The group text was silent toward me now, like I had been quietly erased. But tradition is a powerful thing, and shame is even more persuasive. So I went. I baked a pie, the same one I always brought. It felt performative, hollow, but I did it anyway. As I drove to my aunt's house, I rehearsed how I'd carry myself. Neutral, calm, cordial. I wouldn't apologize, but I wouldn't provoke. I just wanted to survive it. When I arrived, I could feel it before I even stepped inside. The weight in the air. The way no one looked directly at me at first. My entrance was met with a few quick nods, a forced smile or two. No hugs, no warmth. I wasn't unwelcome, but I was clearly not embraced. I placed the pie on the kitchen counter. No one acknowledged it. It sat there, unnoticed, next to dishes people raved over. My cousin's sweet potatoes got a compliment. My mother's stuffing was declared perfect, as always. But mine was invisible. I was invisible. Dinner was served like a ceremony, every motion rehearsed and familiar. Plates passed, chairs scraped against tile, glasses clinked. And all the while I felt the silence around me growing denser. It wasn't that no one spoke. It was that no one spoke to me. The conversation swirled around me like wind around a tree. My name wasn't mentioned. My contributions weren't acknowledged. I became an observer in a room where I had once been central, the dependable one, the bringer of extra chairs, the filler of drinks, the one who stayed late to help clean. But that version of me was gone now, and no one had quite figured out what to do with the version that replaced her. Even my chair placement had changed. I wasn't seated near the heart of the table like in past years. I was on the end now between two relatives who barely spoke. I didn't complain. I folded my napkin in my lap and ate quietly, nodding when appropriate, smiling when necessary. I said thank you. I asked polite questions, but I was a ghost. There were no outright confrontations, no dramatic scenes. That would have been easier, in a way. At least conflict is honest. But silence is far more cutting. It leaves room for your imagination to torture you. I imagined what had been said before I arrived. I imagined the looks exchanged, the whispered remarks. I imagined how many people believed I had changed for the worse, when all I had done was say the thing I was never allowed to say. No. At one point, one of the children, my brother's youngest, came up to me. She looked confused, maybe even hurt. I could see it in her eyes, the way children feel tension they can't articulate. I wanted to hug her. I wanted to explain things she'd never understand until she was much older, but she was gently ushered away before I could speak. That stung more than anything else, not the silence from adults who had made their choice, but the quiet distancing of innocence. I had always loved those kids. I had cared for them, held them, comforted them. And now I was a stranger. Someone who had drawn a line that adults couldn't explain, so they painted me as cold. I finished my meal, cleared my plate, and washed it myself. No one offered help. No one thanked me. I was just a presence, tolerated, but not invited. I didn't stay for dessert. I made my excuses, polite, emotionless, and slipped out before anyone could stop me. Not that they would. The cold night air was a relief. It felt cleaner than anything I'd felt inside that house. I got into my car, pie untouched in its tray beside me, and sat for a while before turning the engine on. My hands were shaking, not from sadness, but from restraint. I had made it through without crying, without flinching. I had walked into the storm and come out dry. But I was tired. Not from the dinner, or the tension, or the silence, but from the lifetime of roles I had played to avoid moments like this. I had been the peacemaker, the helper, the fixer, just to prevent this exact isolation. And now that I had let go of those roles, I was alone. But strangely, it felt more honest than anything I had experienced in years. That night, back at home, I sat in my living room with the lights off. I didn't need noise. I didn't need company. I needed to feel everything I had suppressed in that house. The grief, the anger, the relief. I let it wash over me like waves, one emotion after another, until I was empty. And then, in that stillness, I realized something. The loneliness I felt wasn't punishment. It was clarity. And clarity, no matter how painful, is a form of freedom. 3 months passed before I heard anything substantial about Dylan's situation. Not from him, not from our mother. Just a shared photo on social media, an image of a balloon arch over a small, slightly worn porch. The caption read something like, "New beginnings with my favorite people," followed by a string of emojis and vague hashtags. It was the kind of post meant to look celebratory on the outside, but underneath, I felt the undertow of something sharp and deliberate. It was their new place, not fancy, definitely smaller than mine, but theirs. Or at least, I assumed it was. I didn't ask. I wasn't invited. I wasn't even tagged. That was how I learned they had moved on. I stared at the post longer than I should have. Not because I wanted to go, not because I needed their approval, but because something about the whole thing sat wrong with me. It wasn't the fact that they had moved. It was the performative pride, the curated image of triumph, of survival, of unity. All of it screamed, "We did it without you." And maybe they had, but they needed me to know it. A week later, another photo surfaced. This one was a group shot, familiar faces, smiling. My mother was there, in the center. One of my aunts, a cousin who used to come to me for help with her taxes. Even a neighbor I remembered babysitting for once, long ago. They were all gathered around a table, plastic cups in hand, surrounded by decorations that looked homemade but cheerful. The caption underneath was lighter this time, something about family, resilience, and gratitude. But I wasn't in the photo. I wasn't in any of them, not even mentioned in the comments. It didn't matter how many times I told myself that I had done the right thing, that I had chosen sanity over martyrdom. That setting a boundary didn't make me a villain. None of that mattered in those moments where I saw myself deliberately cropped out of the narrative. That party was more than just a housewarming. It was a declaration, a statement, a new version of the story in which I didn't exist. Not as a helper, not as a sister, not as a daughter. I had removed myself, and now they were erasing me in return. For days, I carried that weight around. It settled in my chest like damp cotton, uncomfortable, heavy, but impossible to shake. I found myself questioning everything again. Was it really necessary to say no the way I did? Could I have softened it somehow? Should I have offered more, been gentler, made room? But the answers were always the same. I had been soft for 33 years. I had bent and bent until the shape of me was unrecognizable. And the first time I stood upright, they decided I was rigid, cold, cruel. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, I had finally stopped apologizing for needing something of my own. The strangest part of it all was that my life had become calmer. The phone didn't ring with emergencies anymore. No late-night calls asking for favors. No last-minute babysitting. No financial loans that were never repaid. The silence had grown familiar. In some ways, it was even welcome. But it came at a cost. I noticed it in small things, the way my mother stopped liking my posts online, the way I wasn't included in the group text when someone in the family got engaged, the way holidays came and went with no invitation, no mention, no drama, just nothing. It was a quiet exile, and in the quiet, I started to build something new. I went back to therapy, more consistently this time, not just to process the boundary, but to unravel the years that led to it. I unpacked memories I hadn't touched in decades. The birthday I spent alone because Dylan had the flu. The time I cleaned the kitchen after everyone left just to hear my mom say, "I don't know what I'd do without you." The countless times I gave up something I wanted to keep the peace. I had always believed love meant being needed. But now, with no one needing me, I was forced to ask what was left. The answer came slowly. In weekends where I slept late without guilt. In mornings where I made breakfast without interruption. In the quiet joy of repainting the guest room. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I filled the shelves with books I'd been meaning to read. I rearranged furniture. I hung art. For the first time in my life, I created a space that didn't have to accommodate anyone but me. I didn't become happier overnight. Healing isn't linear. Some days I missed them all deeply, even though I knew they missed a version of me I couldn't be anymore. Some nights I lay awake wondering if they were talking about me, rewriting the story to make themselves the heroes and me the antagonist. I'd wonder if they believed their own version. But the ache became part of the background. Not a wound anymore, just a scar. I didn't reach out. Neither did they. The gap widened, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like proof that I had finally chosen a different path, one that didn't ask me to disappear to be accepted. I still thought about that housewarming party sometimes, about the streamers and the smiles and the curated captions. But I no longer wanted to be in the photo, because I knew something they didn't. Peace doesn't always look like togetherness. Sometimes it looks like sitting alone in a room you earned, with the door locked, the lights dimmed, and your name finally safe in your own mouth. By the time February rolled in, most of the tension had settled into a kind of cold silence. I had grown used to the stillness. No calls, no texts, no birthdays remembered, and none acknowledged. It was a quiet estrangement, the kind where everyone pretends nothing's wrong but refuses to speak unless it's through someone else. I didn't chase anyone. I stayed in my home, kept to my routines, and told myself this was what healing looked like. And for a while, I believed it. Then I found out what my mother did. It started with something small, barely noticeable at first. A frame in the hallway, slightly off-center. I had hung it carefully weeks ago and hadn't touched it since. Then it was the kitchen drawer, the one where I kept the scissors and spare batteries. I remembered organizing it, labeling everything just the way I liked. But one morning I opened it and found the scissors on the wrong side and batteries scattered. I told myself I was being forgetful. I told myself I was overthinking. But the evidence kept stacking. My bedroom window was cracked open one afternoon when I came home from work, even though I never opened it in winter. Then the back porch light was on one night, even though I always turned it off before bed. I started wondering if I was losing my mind. I checked doors obsessively, kept a log of lights and locks, tried to convince myself that maybe I was just stressed, just anxious, just imagining things. And then, one afternoon, I saw the car. It was parked across the street. Familiar, worn, the same faded silver sedan my mother had driven since I was in college. She wasn't inside. No one was. But I knew that car like I knew my own reflection. And suddenly, everything fell into place. I had given her a spare key years ago. It was back when I first moved in, before boundaries were even a concept I dared to consider. It had felt harmless, even thoughtful. Just in case of emergencies, I'd said. But now that key wasn't just a formality, it was a breach. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask. I didn't need confirmation. The signs were clear enough. Someone had been in my house, someone who felt entitled to my space, my time, my privacy, someone who had watched me say no and decided that it didn't count. I changed the locks the next day. It wasn't an act of anger. It wasn't even about safety, not in the physical sense. It was about reclaiming something intangible, my space, my decision, my autonomy. For years, I had allowed other people to enter my life without permission, to rearrange me, to override me, to make assumptions about what belonged to them. That ended the moment I held the new keys in my hand. Still, the betrayal stayed with me. It wasn't just that she had crossed a line. It was that she didn't even seem to recognize it as a line. To her, I wasn't a daughter with boundaries. I was a daughter with resources. A house, a car, a spare key. She had treated those things as extensions of herself, like access to me was her right, not a privilege. That realization carved a new kind of grief into me. Not the grief of losing someone, but the grief of finally seeing them clearly. It was the ache of acknowledging that the person you've loved your whole life may never love you in the way you need. Not because they're incapable, but because they don't see the need. After I changed the locks, I didn't say anything. I didn't explain. I didn't announce it. I just stopped pretending. I moved through my house like it was truly mine for the first time. I stopped checking my phone for messages that never came. I stopped looking across the street for her car. I stopped waiting for someone to give me back what I had finally taken for myself. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, morning light through the kitchen window, the sound of a quiet evening untouched by obligation, the relief of knowing that if something in my house moved, it was because I moved it. I had never realized how much tension I'd been living with until it finally began to dissolve. I still missed them. Sometimes I'd find myself scrolling through old photos, looking for proof that we had once been close, that the love I gave had been real, even if it wasn't returned in the way I needed. But I no longer confused guilt with connection. I no longer saw silence as something I had to fix. I had changed the locks on my doors, yes, but I had also changed the ones around my heart, and for the first time, I wasn't ashamed of that. The days began to feel longer after I changed the locks. Not because I was doing more, but because I was finally doing less. For the first time in years, there were no emergencies to answer, no unspoken demands waiting for me in group chats or guilt-laced voicemails, just quiet, long stretches of uninterrupted silence, the kind that used to make me uncomfortable, but now felt like an invitation to breathe again. In the absence of noise, my life became painfully honest. Every emotion I had pushed down for decades began to surface. Resentment, sadness, loneliness, and underneath it all, a strange, unfamiliar sense of calm. I wasn't happy, not yet, but I was beginning to understand what peace might look like. And it didn't involve being needed by people who only saw my worth when I was giving something away. I started small. I began walking every morning before work, just around the block at first, then further. The stillness of early morning gave me something I hadn't known I needed, a space to exist without expectation. I'd pass the same trees, the same mailboxes, the same quiet windows, and with every step, I felt the weight of performance fall away. There was no one to impress, no one to serve, no one to manage. Just me. Some mornings I cried, not from sadness, but from release. My tears weren't dramatic. They came quietly, like condensation on glass. Slow, persistent. I cried for the years I gave without receiving, for the woman I might have become if I hadn't been taught that love was earned through self-erasure. I cried for the younger version of myself who tried so hard to be good and never once stopped to ask if she was okay. Eventually, I started seeing a therapist again. I had tried therapy once in college, but back then I was still too deep inside the story I was trying to rewrite. Now, with space and time between me and the roles I used to perform, I found myself more willing to tell the truth about my family, about the exhaustion, about the subtle manipulations that shaped my choices for so long. Therapy didn't offer instant clarity, but it gave me language for things I had never known how to name. Boundaries, enmeshment, conditional love. I learned that guilt is often the echo of control, that just because someone raised you doesn't mean they have the right to shape you forever. I learned that saying no isn't selfish, it's sacred. I started journaling again. At first, the pages were messy, full of half-thoughts and scribbled rage, but over time, they softened. My words became slower, more deliberate. I stopped writing for catharsis and started writing for clarity. I asked myself questions I had never dared to ask. What do I want, separate from what I've been told I should want? What would my life look like if I lived it only for myself? The answers didn't come all at once, but the act of asking changed everything. I decluttered my house next. Not just the drawers and closets, but the emotional residue of a life built around being useful. I let go of things I had kept out of obligation. Gifts from people who made me feel small. Clothes I wore to please others. Furniture arranged to make guests more comfortable. I rearranged everything, not for beauty, but for belonging. For once, I wanted my space to reflect me, not who I had been for everyone else. I planted a few things in the backyard that spring, nothing too ambitious, just some herbs, a row of flowers, a few potted vegetables. I wasn't trying to build a garden, I just wanted to watch something grow under my care that didn't ask for too much. Something simple, predictable, honest. Watching those plants root and stretch toward the sun became a daily ritual. And somehow, in their growth, I found my own reflection. The distance from my family stayed firm. They didn't reach out. I didn't either. I stopped checking their social media. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head that would never happen. I let go of the fantasy that they might come around, apologize, or even try to understand. Acceptance didn't come from anything they did. It came from realizing that closure is often something we have to give ourselves. Sometimes I still missed them. Not the chaos, not the obligation, but the memory of what I wanted them to be. I missed the idea of family, the kind that holds you, sees you, chooses you even when you say no. I missed the imagined warmth of a shared meal, the feeling of being part of something. But when I looked back at the reality of those moments, they were always laced with discomfort, with compromise, with me disappearing to make room. Now, I was learning how to take up space. There were days when I still felt guilty, days when I questioned everything all over again. But those days grew fewer, and the guilt grew quieter. Like a bruise fading into yellow, still there, but no longer tender. I started making new connections too, small at first, a book club at the local library, a neighbor I chatted with on morning walks, an old coworker I invited over for coffee. These weren't grand friendships, but they were real, uncomplicated, built on mutual respect, not obligation. For the first time, I was choosing people who didn't expect me to shrink in order to fit into their lives. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I began to feel like myself again. Not the version of me that everyone else had created, but the quiet, steady voice underneath, the one I had ignored for years. She was softer than I expected, more patient, more whole. She didn't need to be needed. She just needed to be heard, and I was finally listening. The 1-year mark came quietly. There was no celebration, no announcement, no special dinner, just a regular Wednesday, soft light slipping through the blinds, the sound of birds outside my kitchen window. I sat with a cup of coffee in hand and realized, without ceremony, that a full year had passed since the day I said no. 12 months since I watched my mother stand at my doorstep with my brother's family in tow. 12 months since I refused to be overtaken in my own home. 12 months since everything changed. I didn't know then how far-reaching the consequences would be. I thought I was simply setting a boundary. I didn't know I was burning a bridge that had been crumbling for years. Looking back now, I don't regret it. Not because it was easy, it wasn't. Not because it was painless, it hurt in places I didn't even know existed, but because it was necessary, and because it set the foundation for something I never thought I'd have. A life that belongs entirely to me. I no longer walk around my home waiting for someone to show up uninvited. The locks are new. The air is still. The rooms reflect my rhythm now. Quiet mornings, slow dinners, books stacked neatly on the coffee table. Everything is where I want it to be. Not because I'm trying to impress anyone, just because it brings me peace. There's a freedom in solitude I never understood until I lived it. It's not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is when you feel unseen in a crowded room. Solitude is when you're finally seen, by yourself. I used to dread silence. Now I savor it. I used to wait for phone calls that never came. Now I turn my phone off and sleep better than I have in years. I stopped chasing explanations. I stopped trying to decode what my family thought of me, or if they missed me, or if I should have done things differently. Some stories don't need closure. Some wounds only heal when you stop pressing on them, hoping they'll suddenly stop hurting. Instead of answers, I found peace in acceptance. I accepted that I may never get the apology I deserved, that my mother might never understand why what she did hurt so much, that my brother might never take full accountability, that the family I longed for may never exist in the way I imagined. And that's okay, because I've built something else, a life that doesn't require permission, a space that doesn't shrink to make others more comfortable, a self that doesn't disappear in the name of keeping the peace. I still love them. I always will. But I love myself more now. And that love, quiet, hard-earned, unshakable, has become my compass. It's what gets me out of bed. It's what lets me cook dinner just for me and find joy in that. It's what allows me to walk through this world without begging to be understood. It's what teaches me over and over again that being enough doesn't mean being everything for everyone else. I started volunteering at the library on weekends. I joined a local yoga class, even though I was nervous at first. I planted more things in the yard this spring: lavender, basil, a tomato plant that somehow survived the summer heat. I stopped scrolling endlessly through other people's lives and started living mine. Sometimes I still feel the old instincts rising, the urge to help, to fix, to reach back into the past and pull someone forward with me. But then I remind myself that not everyone wants to be saved, and I am not responsible for anyone else's healing but my own. I've met new people, not many, and not all of them have stayed, but enough to remind me that connection doesn't always require history. Sometimes kindness from a stranger is more nourishing than decades of obligation. I've learned how to let people in slowly, not from fear, but from discernment. I choose now. That's the difference. And most of all, I've learned that I don't have to prove my worth through sacrifice. That love given freely, without conditions, without manipulation, is rare, but real. And that it begins, always, with how we love ourselves. This home, this life, this quiet strength I've cultivated, none of it was given to me. I had to fight for it. Not with screaming or fists, but with choices. With the bravery to say no when everyone expected me to say yes. With the courage to sit in silence and not run from it. With the patience to heal without applause. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt like you had to disappear to be accepted, I want you to know something. You don't. You are allowed to draw the line. You are allowed to walk away from what breaks you, even if it's dressed as love. You are allowed to be the person who chooses peace, even when it costs you connection. Especially when it costs you connection. Because some ties are meant to be severed, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. You are not selfish for protecting your space. You are not cruel for demanding respect. You are not broken for wanting more than survival. You are allowed to want joy, to want ease, to want mornings that begin without dread. And if you've made it this far in my story, maybe it's because something in you knows it's time. Time to choose you. So if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support this channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. You never know whose silence hides the same ache, and you never know what healing might begin the moment they realize they're not alone. Thank you for listening. Be well, be brave, and above all, be free.